So on June 11th, 1776, it became clear that the original resolutions proposed by Richard Henry Lee at the behest of the Virginia Congress would not pass, that they did not have enough states supported them. They nevertheless went ahead because most of those objections were to tithing rather than to government. That they went ahead and appointed a committee who would be called on to draft a Declaration of Independence on the assumption that it would be needed at some point. From that committee, whatever happened to the pictures there. But we can see that the committee consisted of John Adams reading left to right, Robert R. Livingston, that should be clearer, yes, Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, Livingston of New York, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. And they were to bring a declaration. The committee very quickly decided that Thomas Jefferson should write at least the first draft. This is a picture you're probably familiar with it. This was painted for the Capitol, when the Capitol building was erected by John Trumbull. John Trumbull was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, he was an officer, and as well as a painter. And this is a part of a much bigger picture, but he is saying here that the committee are now presenting their draft of the declaration to the Speaker of the Continental Congress. So let's go on to the next one. Yes, Jefferson. So Jefferson is going to write it. And as he told us a while back, he repaired it to a house on the outskirts of Philadelphia where he would be bothered, and set himself the task of writing on the West Sea. Barbara Sorensen, now we just stop on it. I think we're going to need the lights on again. That's two birds of all right. Butler is Sorensen. Let's look at it. Everybody's got a copy of his rough draft. You didn't know you were going to have to work on this weekend. All right. He begins with those very familiar words. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, and we all know that. Was that Jefferson, or did he borrow that from somebody else? I think this is his original contribution. I don't believe it's influenced by anyone else. And we then come to behold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, of all men are created equal and independent. And is that totally original with Jefferson? The final draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights read, and you look at Jefferson and say, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inalienable rights, inherent rights, I'm sorry, by which, and they added when they come into a society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That sounds familiar from Jefferson's draft. That we hold these truths to be sacred and so on. And I read a while back that a Jefferson devotee insisted that he couldn't possibly have borrowed that from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. But it occurs to me that it doesn't Rick Scott know what's going on in Tallahassee. Surely he would, if they had just adopted a significant document, the senator would know all about it for 24 hours. And the Virginia Convention had adopted the Declaration of Rights on the first week of June. So I'm sure, a week later, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who was in constant communication with his friends who were meeting then in Richmond, that obviously he drew on that because I was right in front of him. So, yes, there he made this quite a long statement. And it's worth reading. I'm going to take an interruption here for just 1 second. Don't want to put everybody to sleep. I have had a very difficult 24 hours. We have had plumbers in to replace almost all the piping for 2 days. They just finished before I left to come here. And in the course of that, my wife is a semi-invalid, and maybe because she was made nervous by all this, we have been up every half hour practically for the last 24 that she needed this or she had to go to the bathroom or something. And I am just incoherent with fatigue. So if you will bear with me, all right. But anyway, so this paragraph then becomes a very significant statement of what he believed that they were about, shall we dance? And anyway, I can barely see it. It's significant. I think this is Jefferson himself. Now, the next part, it's obvious he had another sword. If we switch to the other thing here, this would be known by an awful lot of people in the colonies, much as even if they can't directly quote a lot of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, most Americans are familiar with there is such a thing, and they know some of it. You don't have to be a legal expert to be aware of that. And where I say this is something he obviously very aware is because the next section follows the same pattern. We are no longer bound to any allegiance to James II, who has done all these bad things. And some of them we'll see in Jefferson's draft, some specific ones. All right. That's the very first one. Assuming an exercising of power of dispensing with and suspending laws. George III is condemned for doing that. But we have to run down a bit here. The long-standing objection that it was illegal to tax the American colony by Parliament. Here it's the it was illegal for the Crown to demand money apart from a grant by Parliament. And the next one is very significant because it appears, at least I think, in both documents, raising and keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace. And here is without consent of Parliament. And it's stuck in here somewhere. But just stay with this document for a while. And separate in Jefferson's draft, 100 soldiers country law. This is a very significant thing in the 18th century, and we seem to have happily gotten away from it in the 20th and 21st. That it was an act of tyranny to have a standing army or navy in times of peace. And it is very much in the background of the Declaration and people who wrote the Constitution, that you shouldn't have a large army, you shouldn't have a huge navy, you should rely for your defense on the local militia. That freemen would come out and serve their country. You didn't have to have professional soldiers around. And that's partly because there is a great fear of a military aristocracy, that you will have Colonel so-and-so and General so-and-so forming a military junta and taking over the country. So, James has done, among other things, limited or violated the freedom of election. And the next one down here, excessive bail. This turns up in Jefferson's draft. Excessive fines and illegal and cruel punishments, all of which are utterly and directly contrary to the known laws and freedom of the realm. Well, let's look at what Jefferson does with this kind of framework. All right. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. This is very much like the beginning of the 1689 document. But this was a real problem in the years leading up to the Revolution, that the Crown or the Board of Trade and the plantations acting in the name of the Crown could say that, yes, you good people of the South Carolina legislature passed this law, but we don't like it. So we're instructing the governor to say it is null and void. And this is the first thing that he lines up here. he has forbidden his governors to pass laws that would be, this is the same thing, really. Part of this is with issues of, there's a great shortage of hard coin money in the colonies. And they use various things in Virginia. They used certificates of tobacco. So you could, pay your London merchants by or your local store by giving them a piece of paper that said that you have 1,500 pounds of first class and been inspected first class tobacco. Now other colonies didn't have that ability, so they wanted to issue paper money, and they issued paper money with great regularity. And Virginia did that too. And this is specifically what I think the governors are told. No, if these people come up with a bill to issue paper money, you tell them they can't do that. So that's that position. He is dissolved representative body. This happened several times in Virginia. And as soon as they passed a resolution in the 1760s saying essentially no taxation without representation, the governor promptly prorogued the assembly, and that was sent the House of Burgesses or whatever local. And then that's done at any time. He has refused for a long space of time. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is. He has refused for a long space of time to cause others to be elected using his legislative powers. And returned in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and compulsion within. Yes.
The word divers.
What?
Divers, what does that mean?
Various.
What is it?
Various of all kinds.
Thank you.
Different came in this specific. So he has separate from electing the people that he needed and leaving them without government. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, and he has attempted to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of birth. I'm unfamiliar with what that particular issue was, because in almost every colony, they had a limited naturalization of foreigners. And they varied, of course, from colony to colony. In Pennsylvania, you could be naturalized if you requested it. Many immigrants, of course, never did. They didn't see any need to bother with the government of Philadelphia. But the one requirement was that you, and this was general in almost all the colonies, that you took communion in a Protestant church. So it meant that if you were a Catholic immigrant, you couldn't possibly be naturalized. And it was primarily directed against Catholics. I don't think it was specifically intended to limit naturalization of Jewish people, because any number of them were in fact naturalized. So they were all big merchants. And then he has suffered the administration of justice. Would somebody like to read that line? I can't quite make it out. He has suffered the administration of justice totally to cease in some of these colonies, refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. That's sort of self-evident. He has made our judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and amount of their salaries. This is another thing that's dragged through the whole 18th century. The lower house in many colonies had the continuous practice that although the governor and or the attorney general and most judges were all appointed from England, their tenure, how long they would serve, and most important, their salaries were in the gift of the lower house of the assembly. So in that way, certainly by 1765, 1770, almost every state had reduced, or colony had reduced the judges and the governor himself, the attorney general, and so on, had reduced them to being creatures of the elected local assembly. I mean, they wanted to get their money in. If that required playing ball with the people in Charleston, the people rather than with London, London wasn't paying them. So that was, and then of course, in the 1770s, there was a very strong effort for Westminster to reverse that, to say that no, we are going to provide the salary for all the royal officials. You are not going to have anything to do. Let's take it as an outrage. He's a resident, a multitude of new offices. Well, that's always an objection. Big government. And has kept us in dividing these standing armies and ships of war. So the fact that the Crown provided regiments of British soldiers in North America, primarily on the frontier, but after 1774, also in Boston, to assure that this was kept intact, and in New York, because that was headquarters. All right. So there were British troops in those two cities, but almost all of them were out in obscure forts in Illinois and Missouri, way out of the frontier. All right. He has affected the render the military independent and superior to the civil power. That specifically refers to Massachusetts, where Governor General Gage was put in charge of everything. Am I driving everybody out? No. Should we just cut this, or But I sort of hope that we would do this back and forth, and that you would be picking up these things, and I would be fielding them. Can we do that? Would people like to do that? Be a little more. I intended this to be an interactive class. It's turned out to be just me groaning and trying to focus on very small. So, is anybody awake? But they
It sort of reminds me of what the Congress that we have now has to say to the president. Not a single word.
Right. Well, we'll try to run through this and get it over there. All right. Yes, write it down there. He is combined with others who subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitutions and unacknowledged by our laws, and done this by quartering troops among us. Question, yeah.
I'm not sure where you are on which document that you're reading from.
Yeah, it's the second page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's it.
He's not on the Bill of Rights, he's on the other document. Yes.
Bill of Rights?
We're on the Constitution, on the Declaration. Jefferson's draft. All right.
That's right.
So, everybody got it? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. He has protected these military occupants from a fair trial by a jury. And he has cut off our trade with all parts of the world. And that had been going on since the 17th century. And until about 1765, maybe 1768, was widely accepted that it was perfectly just and appropriate for the government in London to regulate trade so that, for example, they could not trade directly except with Britain and Ireland, with anything north of Cape Finisterre. So they could trade with the Mediterranean, but not say with France or Holland or anybody else like that directly. Right now, he's imposed taxes on us without our consent. Well, that's no taxation without representation. He has deprived us of the benefits of trial by jury, which goes right back to 1689. We have had the right of trial by jury since Magna Carta in 1215. That's one of the rights of Englishmen. We're transporting this is all part of the same thing, that they were allowing. The problem was that if you had not a locally elected or appointed person in charge of customs, that now they were coming directly from Britain. They were answerable only to London. They were not answerable to the local colonies. If they are charged with, say, taking more money than they were entitled to from a merchant or something, and he sues, it was pretty unlikely that they would be convicted, or they wouldn't be. That their side would be upheld if the trial was being held in New York or Rhode Island. So the British had arranged that any of these people who were charged, or military people, if they are charged with an offense, they had to be tried in Britain. Now that meant, of course, and there's more about this in this document, that that they would not be faced probably by their accusers, as is a right. They, even though it would be favorable to them not to be, and so they would not be judged by their peers. They would not be subject to the penalties where they resided. So it was more on the legislative powers and suspending the legislature, which he had already said he has advocated government here. This is a late thing. When it says he has abdicated government here, it was because the royal governor and his associates withdrew. And then in just about the spring of 1776, it was announced from London that if there is no legitimate government, then we have to consider these people as rebels. He is now transporting large armies of foreign people to complete the works of death. By March 1776, the British withdrew from Boston to Halifax, and they regrouped there, and a large number of regiments were pulled out of Ireland and other places, and also Hessian troops from several German states in the Rhineland were transported, and a very large fleet, probably the largest naval appearance in up to that time in anywhere on the Atlantic, was headed for New York. And I think it's just the 1st or 2nd of July. It's very close to the time of the Declaration was finally adopted, that a young girl at Far Rockaway, looking out, saw a forest out at sea, all these masts, and it was this tremendous naval movement, transports and so on, coming into New York Harbor. So, and he stirred up the Indians. Well, if he did that, and he has incited treasonable insurrection. These were rising by loyalists in several places. In the spring of 1776, for instance, there was a large Scottish colony in South Carolina that had come a very heavy migration in the early 1770s. So they hardly landed that in 1776. And in May 1776, they rose to form an army and marched to the coast, and they were met by local militia and defeated Boers Creek Bridge. And, so that's what the next thing he said. Now, this is the most important piece in the draft. Would somebody like to read that for me? My voice sounds awfully boring to me. All right, we've got a new reader who would see that one paragraph. So I give you the mic. It says, it's this paragraph down here. Yeah.
Your readers, Rick, Marie, we can listen to it.
As long as I know where to read. It says, it started with his wage for war.
That's right.
Yeah, his wage to include war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of liberty, life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact or distinguished die. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he's deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another.
Is that a familiar passage from the Declaration? This is a very important piece that Jefferson put in his draft, and we'll think about that some more. And he goes on that at every stage here, we have tried to negotiate, we have not been faithless subjects, nor for that matter, we sought to alienate our friends, the British merchants, and so on. So, but now we've come to the point where we obviously have to break. So, let's see. Yes.
Just the fourth one, just some examples. He has reckoned a multitude of new offices by a self-assumed power. Example of what he's talking about there?
But
The fourth one of these, he has erected a multitude of new offices. You know, give me an example of what that would be.
you know, this was, well, one obvious example was that he created, or George himself, of course, it was Parliament or the Board of Trade, but they created a whole customs service, which previously had been, people were elected locally, and they played ball with the local merchants and whatnot, whereas these people were coming in as anything. So, and that was a big one. Okay, let's take a look. What was original? Oh, yeah, another question.
In the paragraph he just read, he talked about men should be bought and sold. He has prosecuted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. That this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished die, who is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying all former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, the crimes which he urges him to commit against the lives of another. Is that the first mention of the slave situation, the ownership of slaves, and the whole program of slaves, and trying to create an atmosphere for abolition and emancipation of slaves?
It reflects a situation in Virginia that in 1767 and again in 1772, and the Virginia House of Burgesses had imposed a heavy tax on imports of slaves. They were trying to stop the slave trade. It's possibly it's a whole legislative assembly, so we can't know everybody's mind, but it's possible that some of these people were looking to the abolition of slavery itself. Some of them may also have been saying that if we do not bring in newly imported slaves, then the slaves we already have will rise in value. So they could have been totally selfish on that. But the point was that they were trying to end the slave trade. That they recognizing here that the slave trade, Jefferson had written much like this in 1774, that the slave trade was inhuman. It was evil. The one you couldn't defend. And the second part there is referring to Lord Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation that recruited slaves to serve alongside, because he had no army in Virginia. There were no British soldiers that he was recruiting African Americans to serve and to buy the freedom of which they had been deprived. So those two are very specific Virginia issues, and he was always a Virginian. So that's where that falls. So
Next.
and this passage that you just read and the beginning and the end are certainly very original with him. So let's go with it. How much survived of his original draft? Let's I think we now have a familiar July 4th document. Can that come up in anything? Could we possibly read? It's getting toward the end of time. It seems like the end of time. Let's just pull out two sections. That very important anti-slave trade statement was excluded totally from the Declaration. The committee added a few things, mostly, this was Adams and Franklin. The other two really didn't get into it. They added a few things that, but it was mostly verbal changes. Someone gives you a document you added, wouldn't it be better to say it this way than that way? So their contributions were not large. They added a few things like, in addition to condemning the the Hessian mercenaries, they said there were Scotch mercenaries who were being brought here. And John Witherspoon, the president of Princeton, and a native Scot, gentleman from New Jersey, said, "You can't possibly say that." So that went out, and there were some other things that, but the most significant thing I find that the Congress as a whole did to the final committee draft that was presented by the committee to John Hancock was to take out that whole criticism of the execrable slave trade. And that was at the behest of delegates from Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was a very big slave trading port, and delegates from South Carolina, and they needed everybody to be on board. They couldn't have, any one colony saying, "Oh no, we don't like this declaration. We want it to pass unanimously." And as you know, ultimately it did on the 2nd of July, 1776, with one abstention, namely New York, because they said we were instructed not to vote one way or the other on independence, and we haven't gotten fresh instructions from our legislature at home. So they got those instructions, and I think they voted officially on the 6th of July, but they were allowed to sign the Declaration of 4th anyway. So we've got one more to go. Yes, we got a question. Go. Question.
I'll take this. So, questions?
Yeah.
Thank you. Richard, sorry about the eating. Hope things are going to go all right with your situation at home. I'm curious about whether you have any information or reflection on the relationship of what was going on, particularly France, with respect to similar issues about governance by kings and queens, and with respect to the very by West Indies, where all of these European countries were operating slavery in the world of slavery, and with that fundamental to sugar industry and wealth and protectionism and trade, and a lot of the issues that you see reflected in this document we're reading today. I wonder whether you have any reflection as to the extent to which what was going on at the provincial level within France, because I understand the French Revolution really began out in the provinces long before Bastille Day. So some of these were in the air all the way around a much broader area than America, in terms of trying to find some way to have a better way of governing ourselves than what we were experiencing, because there was a lot of these complaints were not necessarily against the king, they were against Parliament. And I'm sure in France, it was against whatever the Parliament was in France, which I used to know when I was younger. But so I wonder if you have a reflection about what was happening elsewhere than in America that was influencing many of the complaints that you see here, as well as wanting to have some freedom from a king as well as a parliament.
I plead in almost total ignorance. Many years ago, I took part in a conference, an invitation conference in Paris on my pronunciation, les oubliés de la Révolution américaine, the forgotten people of the American Revolution. And there were very good contributions about the native peoples, about African Americans, about the pacifist groups. Actually, I did that one, and other things like that. But that's about as close as I got, except I had to share a series of lectures around 1989 by Patrice Gonnet, who was a scholar of the French Revolution. And I must plead almost total ignorance. That's almost the nature of academia. You concentrate on the history of Bolivia and South America, and you really don't have much of a grounding well, what was going on in Russia at that time. So I guess we're all getting bad. Yeah.
So what was the dynamic in Rhode Island in which at one point they're all pro-slavery because they're selling and marketing slaves, and then they end up as an anti-slavery state later on? Is it because of the marketing dried up, and therefore they don't have that financial incentive?
Yeah. Well, there was a very strong anti-slavery movement in Rhode Island in 1776, probably for some years earlier, led by the Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who had, it was in Providence rather than Newport, but he had the largest congregational church, a very influential man. At the same time, through those years, because of what we call the triangular trade, that they brought Africans to the West Indies primarily, sometimes to other continental colonies. And then they came back with rum and sugar and molasses, and perhaps, and so they were selling those things. Merchants were in Newport were selling those things, and there were a lot of distillers in making rum and so on. So you had a commercial interest that said, yeah, this is a good thing. And you had a kind of moral influence that was saying, no, it isn't. It's a terrible thing. So that was the same thing that's true of South Carolina, that on the grounds that they needed slaves, they didn't have as many as some of the other colonies. They needed slaves, even though there's a famous book with this title. The South Carolina had a black majority. There were more African Americans in South Carolina than there were white people, even with a fairly heavy migration into upper South Carolina, of Scotch Irish and Germans coming down. So, but they had a big slave trade. But so it's interesting that some people who you would think would have stayed with the slave trade, as I think Henry Lawrence, for example, in South Carolina, he was a slave trader. And he came around and said, no, this is a horrible thing. Why could I ever do this? And a number of other people. George Mason's brother, Towson Mason, and advertised as newly imported slaves a couple of times. And, they had swung around to a very different people. But they said people changed. But anyway, clever at the time, maybe. So thank you. Thank you for being a very good, faithful audience. That is all in the moment. So, thanks again.